Good evening and welcome. This is the July 1st edition of 1986. I'm Roger Mudd.
And I'm Connie Chung. 10 years ago tomorrow, the Supreme Court of the United States reinstated the death penalty. And tomorrow, a man named Ted Bundy was going to die in Florida's electric chair. He's been granted a last-minute stay of execution, pending an appeal based on legal technicalities.
Ted Bundy is not just another death row inmate. Convicted of 3 murders in Florida, suspected of a great many more in Washington State, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. Ted Bundy became infamous to the people in those states partially because of the extreme brutality of his crimes and also because his trial was widely televised.
The most shocking thing about Ted Bundy is what he is not. He's not a wild beast to look at or to hear, not brutal seeming, not at first or even at second glance, a man to shun. And that is the horror. As Lucky Severson reports, Ted Bundy was possessed by evil, but he was possessed too of a fatal charm.
This court has hereby imposed the death penalty upon Theodore Robert Bundy.
What's a man like Ted Bundy doing in a place like this?
Ted Bundy was a charmer. He charmed the shoes off of him.
He was an enjoyable, likable, attractive person.
He was thoughtful, charismatic.
And overall, he was quite personable.
Authorities in 4 states agree that Bundy was personable. They also agree that he was a savage killer.
The defendant bludgeoned and pummeled her about the head. She had a ligature around her neck, which was a pantyhose that strangled her. As to count 2 of the indictment, while the victim was in her bed, was stripped of her night clothing, 1 nipple was incised and bit off. There was evidence of vaginal and anal trauma, and she was left in a pool of blood in her own bed.
Ted Bundy had a talent for murder, for mutilations even more repulsive than those described by the judge. He was convicted of 3 murders, but is believed to be the killer of perhaps 40 women. No other man has ever been held responsible for killing so many college-aged women. Bundy is 39, articulate, and in a bizarre way, thoughtful. Here at the Florida State Prison, he talked in detail about what goes through a killer's mind. And when he dies in the electric chair, he will have left behind not only a legacy of horror, but maybe also some clues to the heart and mind of a murderer.
9 years ago at a jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, I talked with Ted Bundy shortly after he'd been convicted of kidnapping a young woman. He'd been sentenced only a few days earlier. His calm appearance was deceiving.
I didn't show any emotion because, what am I supposed to do? Am I going to jump up on the table? Am I going to scream? That's what I felt like doing. I heard my mother crying. It's an emotional time. I don't even like to think of that day. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down.
Bundy has said he developed this kind of icy control over his emotions when he was a teenager in Tacoma, Washington, with a very low opinion of himself.
I compensated for it by being seemingly aloof and arrogant and intellectual. I always, inside of me, felt that people did not find me attractive or likable this is my own opinion of myself.
One classmate remembers Ted as a bit of a prude who used the word embrace for making love. Years later, politics brought Bundy out of his shell. Richard Larson was a Seattle political reporter who became Bundy's friend.
When he stepped into the world of politics with the physical capabilities that he had, the mental capabilities, he encountered a diverse group of professional people, a fairly glittering group, really, and a group that welcomed him.
The social life came with it. You were accepted. You went out to dinner with people. They invited you to dinner. This is where they were. They took you to drinks, and there it was, a life that had been missing for me.
And there he was, an operative for the Republican gubernatorial candidate, pleasant and sophisticated, even when he was accused of political spying.
It's hard for me to believe that what I did is newsworthy. And my part in the campaign was so insignificant, I'm embarrassed that I should be getting this publicity from it. Really embarrassed.
Bundy's years in the Pacific Northwest were busy ones. He earned a degree in psychology, entered law school, and worked in mental health and law enforcement. By all appearances, he was on the road to success. In 1974, police began investigating crimes involving women, mostly college students. Nearly every month, in and around Seattle, a young woman was murdered or disappeared. Lake Sammamish State Park. On the day these scenes were filmed, someone, calling himself Ted, asked several young women individually to help load a canoe on his car. 4 that we know of said no and walked away. 2 others disappeared from the beach. Months later, police found their remains along with those of several other young women. The Ted witnesses described was shown in posters, but in the beginning, Bundy was not a suspect. He says police were looking for a criminal type, not a clean-cut law student like himself.
They get hundreds upon hundreds of leads. Which one are they going to pick? The law student with no criminal background, or are they going to, go after the real weirdos?
Although Bundy has never admitted harming anyone, he did talk to the authors of this book about what goes on in a killer's mind, how he thinks. But he always refers to the killer as someone other than himself. Those conversations, about 150 hours in all, were recorded on audio tape. In this cell, but not while our cameras were there. Bundy talks about how simple fantasies can set the stage for a horrible reality.
He would be out in society viewing and being exposed to the television ads and the girly magazines and the women in hot pants in the streets and all these things that tended to nurture his condition, exacerbate it, agitate it.
He enjoyed reading girly books, soft pornography, that sort of thing. In his case, however, rather than being simply attracted,
Stephen Michaud was one of the 2 authors who interviewed Bundy.
Excited by them, it began a process whereby fantasies developed. And the fantasies were at first very, very crude and unformed kinds of uneasiness or whatever that could not be satisfied by simply looking at a naked woman.
It's another step to visualize that beautiful woman as being the victim of some kind of violent activity. What's not being recognized is that slowly, imperceptibly again, that very basic inhibitions about engaging in this kind of conduct are being eroded.
Those fantasies almost become real.
Dr. Al Carlisle, Bundy's psychologist at the Utah State Prison.
And the person doesn't go out to murder someone that particular night, but the opportunity comes up, say a rape occurs, and then the killing occurs after that. And now the person has, to a degree, fulfilled that fantasy.
The fantasy was grotesque. It included a desire to possess the lifeless body. Example, he lured a young woman from this tavern to his apartment and then seduced her.
After the first sexual encounter, gradually his sexual desire builds back up and joins those other unfulfilled desires, and wanting to fulfill this other need to totally possess her, as it were, as she lay there because he strangled her to death.
As untroubled as he was by the strangling, Bundy was just as casual about not removing the body.
There wouldn't be an urgency, since she was in a place which was private, which was this man's house. Just leave her in the bed, put her in a closet. I mean, no one's coming in.
The actual murdering itself was not what he was after. You have a two-part thrill, if you will. The hunt, the fantasy hunt, right? The possession of the girl, and then the enactment of the fantasy with the lifeless body over hours or days until she has to be disposed of.
Another series of violent crimes began after Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend his second law school. Once more, young women were involved, this time in Utah and Colorado. Again, they were murdered or they vanished, and one was kidnapped, but she got away. Bundy was sentenced on the kidnapping charge. After that, he was transferred to Colorado to face trial for murder. I met him there.
Do you ever think when you're in that cell about the possibility that you could one day face a firing squad?
They don't have firing squads in Colorado, and I don't think that in any event that I ever think. I don't think about it, honest to God.
He said to me, where would a person be most likely to be executed in the United States if they committed a heinous crime? And at the time, I didn't think there would be any reason for him to ask that other than interest.
Attorney John Henry Brown, a Bundy friend.
I said Florida, because the Florida death penalty statute had just been upheld by the United States Supreme Court.
Not long after that conversation, Bundy climbed through the jail's ventilator shaft and escaped. But why, after learning that Florida would be the first to reimpose capital punishment, would he travel to Tallahassee, the state's capital, and 2 weeks later go on a homicidal binge? One theory is that extreme risks produce extreme thrills.
Psychologists tell me that you have to heighten the excitement, and so you expose yourself to greater danger and move on to the next stage, which is more elevated in danger. And, you know, if it happens to be a thing of homicide, then Florida would be the stage of greatest danger.
Bundy says confinement in prison increases the craving for violence.
We could conclude that if this person was forced to forego gratifying his needs for an extended period of time, that need would only become stronger and become more demanding and force this individual to act less deliberately and more rashly.
Tallahassee, 1978. Bundy invaded a sorority house like a rabid animal, attacking one young woman as she slept, raping her viciously, biting her, and clubbing her to death. In another room, he clubbed one woman on the head and face, then turned on her roommate. Both survived. He moved on to another room and beat and strangled the woman, the second bloody killing in the house. Bundy, who was convicted of these murders, had been examined by mental health professionals in Utah and Florida. They found he was not medically or legally crazy. As he wrote at the bottom of this evaluation, "Nor will I ever be." In all his court cases, Bundy has never pleaded that he was insane, nor has he ever said he was sorry, even when, acting as his own attorney, he summoned one of the women he had attacked to jail for a deposition. Karen Chandler didn't get the chance to ask her own questions.
I mean, I would like to ask him why. What makes a person do something like that? What makes a person that's so smart and has so much do something like that?
There's nothing in my background, I swear to God, and I know it. I know there's nothing in my background. No one factor or collection of factors which would explain or would otherwise lead one to believe that I was capable of committing murder.
You would think that somewhere in Ted Bundy's childhood he had been badly mistreated by women, but that doesn't appear to be the case, nor is there any evidence that Bundy grew up hating women. In junior high, he discovered he was born out of wedlock, but it was not a turning point in his life. He remained close to his mother, a classic hearts and flowers relationship. His attempts to have a conventional life often were unconventional, like the time in a Florida courtroom when he summoned his girlfriend, Carol Boone, as a witness and married her.
Will you marry me?
Yes.
And I do hereby marry you. Thank you.
And this convicted killer, who fathered a daughter, tried to have a semblance of family life with daughter, stepson, and wife. Under the circumstances, his ties to women were almost normal.
However, at one end of the spectrum of his behavior, what he calls the 1% or less than 1% of him, there is this antisocial urge to kill women and to possess them, as he said, like a potted plant or a Porsche, about which he feels no guilt.
He was not able to muster a natural and a normal ability to feel compassion for that individual or to place a high value on the sanctity of life.
And one of his more memorable lines was, the past is not real. Who can touch the past? The past is no more real than a mist. And that is what he meant when he said that the girls weren't real. He simply denied their existence.
Of the 40 killings that point to Bundy, 2 victims were found just after an attack. 7 are still missing. The rest were discovered weeks and months after they were murdered. Skeletons, bodies decomposed, or ravaged by wild animals.
Did he express any sympathy for you?
No.
None at all?
No.
Did he express any sympathy for any of the victims at all?
Clearly they're people. Clearly they're flesh and blood and they have, all the characteristics of human beings, but he would not allow himself to feel those emotions for the victim.
Last week, we reported the story of Alvin Ford, another man on Florida's death row.
Are you sorry you shot Officer Allen Coffin?
No.
Ford's lawyers claimed that he had gone...
Robert Bundy. Bundy once lived in both Seattle and Tacoma. He's charged in Salt Lake City with aggravated kidnap and attempted murder. King News Service has learned that Seattle police are sending a detective to Salt Lake City tonight. Robin, what's the latest on the story?
Well, Steve, at the moment, there is no known connection between Ted Bundy and the women found murdered in Washington. But police are bearing down again in their investigation into the Ted murder cases in Washington state. And they say they have a renewed interest in Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Bundy was a young man King County Police once looked at as a possible suspect in connection with the Ted murders in Washington. A 1972 graduate of the University of Washington and a second-year law student at the time of his arrest in Salt Lake City. At a press conference this morning, Seattle Police Chief Robert Hansen announced a special task force being formed to study Ted Bundy.
Yeah, this is your copy.
That is the wrong film, but we should have it up in just a little bit. Ted Bundy was first brought to the attention of the King County Police by a phone call from a citizen, and he became one of nearly 3,000 Ted suspects in the area. Our source in Salt Lake City says it was Ted Bundy's brown Volkswagen that led to his arrest in Utah, a brown Volkswagen similar to one witnesses recall seeing at Lake Sammamish State Park on July 14th, 1974. That was the day that Janice Ott and Denise Naslund disappeared. There's another person who remembers Ted Bundy driving a Volkswagen. That is his landlady in Seattle. Bundy lived in a house in the University District for several years until August 1974, when he left for Utah to attend law school. Bundy's upstairs apartment was at 4143 12th Northeast, and that's several blocks from Linda Ann Healy's basement apartment. She was last seen alive in January 1974. In 1972, Ted Bundy joined Governor Evans' re-election campaign staff. His job was to follow former Governor Albert Rossellini to public meetings and to news conferences, and he was to report back what was said. And on August 29, 1974, Ted Bundy talked to King News Service disclaiming any political dirty tricks. As I said, we will have that film shortly. The one thing that nearly everyone agrees on, whoever knew Ted Bundy, is that the whole thing must be a mistake. They say they are shocked and they hope that the police have the wrong man. Interest in Ted Bundy has also been stirred up in Colorado. And police authorities there, who also have cases of murdered and missing women, have made inquiries about Ted Bundy with Utah police.
Robin, can you tell us what Seattle Police Chief Robert Hansen and County Chief Larry Walt are saying about Ted Bundy tonight?
Well, Chief Robert Hansen today said that he would be putting two detectives on the case of the two women in Seattle. That's Georgianne Hawkins and Linda Ann Healy, to see if there were any connection to Ted Bundy. And Lawrence Walt said that now that this whole thing has happened in Utah, there is definitely a renewed interest in this one suspect.
And we should point out again, to wrap it up, Ted Bundy is not a suspect, at least according to Seattle police. He is a suspect, but one of many, according to King County
One of 3,000.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you, Robin. The man most of us know as Ted has been seen only in a picture. It's a composite drawing that police created from eyewitness accounts. But police say Ted is a real man, and they have spent the last 15 months trying to track him down. Paul Boyd takes a look at the history of this case.
King County Police launched their investigation after Denise Naslund and Janice Ott vanished from Lake Sammamish State Park in July 1974. At least 7 people at the crowded beach saw and heard a man who called himself Ted. He was described as a smooth-talking man with his arm in a cast who asked several women to help him load a boat onto a Volkswagen. A massive search was launched for Ted, and police were flooded with calls from citizens who said they had seen the suspect. The first break in the case came with the discovery of the skeletal remains of 6 women in the mountains east of Seattle. With the bodies found all in one place, bodies of women who disappeared from places as far away as Corvallis and Seattle, police realized that one man was probably responsible for the deaths of at least 8 women. A special 11-man task force was set up by King County to handle the case, and to date that group has investigated nearly 2,800 possible Ted suspects. King County authorities worked out a deal with the Department of Motor Vehicles that each time a suspect was named, police showed that man's driver's license picture to the Lake Sammamish witnesses. In that fashion, they eliminated thousands of potential suspects. But when it appeared this spring that the investigation had reached a dead end, police admitted that they would only catch Ted if he committed another crime and got caught. Detectives are now hard at work to determine if it was Theodore Bundy who made that mistake. This is Paul Boyd for King News Service.
But through all the excitement of the Salt Lake City arrest, there's one man here in Seattle who's not at all excited. He is Captain Nick Mackey. He headed up the investigation of the local murders from the very beginning. News Service columnist Don McGaffin reports. Don?
Jeannie, the reason Captain Nick Mackey says he's not excited is simple. He says Ted Bundy is not a prime suspect in the murder of the Seattle women. After announcing months ago that he'd hold no more news conferences until his investigators had something definite to announce, he had a news conference today to unannounce Bundy.
Process of investigation now, and we have been for some time. This is why one of the reasons I called this. It was said in some releases that we looked at him and were not interested. That's not true. Another one said that we have done no follow-up since the arrest in Salt Lake City. This is not a true statement because we're not doing anything different. We've been on him. We've been investigating him as we have many others. I'd like to emphasize that because he is not the one suspect.
Mackey says there is no prime suspect, and the chief detective in the investigation now seems to be the county's computer, a computer with the nickname Ralphie. Ralphie has memorized nearly 2,800 names of suspects. It has memory banked more than 3,500 pieces of information. It cross-matches, re-references, but so far has produced no one worthy of the status prime suspect. And this electronic detective doesn't work for peanuts. The cost so far, more than $30,000 for computer runs. Mackey added that the pictures of Ted Bundy so far have produced no results when showed to the witnesses. And he said he has no plans to send any county detectives up to Salt Lake City.